SDN, in a lot of cases, winds up being one that treats it as something of maybe a bit more of an apocalyptic view, as though it was some great looming threat that was sort of rising above us. Who we have here sitting on the stage, enjoying this wonderful parquet, VMware, Microsoft, Broadcom. We've got software vendors, I think, for whom you haven't always seen eye to eye, maybe, I think we might generously say, and a semiconductor vendor, someone who hasn't typically been part of the discussion around networking, or at least more actively. I'd just like to throw the question out there initially. You guys are all out here. What does it start to say about networking and really what's happening more broadly with us in networking today? Yeah, Rajiv, why don't we start? We'll start at the end.
Well, since I'm the guy at the bottom of the food chain, I guess I go first. So you know, I mean, if you look at the networking food chain, you have the silicon at the bottom, and then you have the people who take the silicon, build boxes around it, and then you put an operating system and a protocol stack over it. Maybe it's distributed, maybe it's centralized, some of the new open flow models coming in. And then you have controllers, you have applications that reside on the network, and then somebody then who sells and services customers such as yourselves. And I think one of the things that clearly is changing here is that it doesn't have to be that the same vendor provides the whole thing from soup to nuts. And you're going to see different people who are good at doing different pieces of this food chain. And that's going to have certainly an impact in terms of how you folks consume networks and who your vendors might be going forward for some of these things.
Rajiv, is that a place where if you talk about that food chain, I mean, there are a lot of changes that are taking place. What does this mean about the discussion more broadly about networking and where that fits?
I think Rajiv has a very good point. I think it's very interesting to look at the drivers for change in networking. And I can think of three. First one is technological innovation. So if you look at technological innovation, there's innovation in terms of increased control and programmability. It's one part of SDN as we commonly know it. Then there's the advent of network virtualization and intelligence at the edge. That's the other part of networking of SDN as we know it. And the third thing is the availability of very capable merchant silicon. So those are the technological drivers. Combine those technological drivers with two other changes that are happening. One is the advent of cloud service providers, and which actually do, I believe, have a deep impact on networking. And I'll speak from the perspective of Windows Azure, for example. Scale changes everything. When you're deploying or managing hundreds of thousands of physical machines, when you are managing exabytes of data, when you are essentially manipulating billions of objects, and you're provisioning or deprovisioning thousands of networks a day, you run into some interesting challenges. So that's the second driver of change. And then the third driver of change, I believe, is essentially basically the evolution. Customer needs are changing because of the customers are increasingly getting mobile, many endpoints, essentially mobile endpoints, the need for richer experiences to be delivered to these endpoints, and I think that is also driving substantial change. So these drivers of change, in combination with some of the things Rajiv said, I think are having a deep impact on networking.
Well, and Martine, I think in this space, if we look at that deep impact, I mean, it looks like we're starting to change the faces that are starting to have a greater portion of the conversation around that impact.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think like normally when we think about supply chain, we think about boxes, at least traditionally. And it's pretty clear that the voices of the dialogue has changed with different members. So for example, we have customers that have direct conversations with the silicon vendors or direct conversations with us and the networking teams on the software layer. And so I think a lot about SDN is not kind of what happens or how the traditional supply chain is disrupted, but more who are the new voices and how do they influence the customer and the customer purchasing decision.
I'd like to start with some more formalized questions, sort of kick around some of what these changes really mean. You talk about the changes and talk about the changes in those conversations. When we're looking at shifts in network functionality, how does that change those traditional channels? I mean, both of you talked about really what that engagement looks like. But how does this really change the supply chain? What does that conversation change in the broader sense as we start moving towards greater, more flexible capability?
You know, again, I think you need to look at every level in the food chain and see what changes as a result of this, right? So clearly, if you start at the bottom layer, you're going to start with, networks based on what Rajiv said in terms of requirements. You're going to see a need for faster and flatter networks, right? It's not going to be the traditional oversubscribed north-south traffic patterns. Now you have workload mobility that needs to happen. You have applications that require a lot more machine-to-machine communication, so you have a lot more east-west traffic. So you're going to have to build out fast, scale-out networks. And so there's a layer that's going to be focusing on building that out and building that very well. There's going to be another layer that focuses on what's the best software to run on it, what's the simple architecture to put on it. Maybe it's layer 3 CMP, or maybe it's a large layer 2 domain. But you have to simplify how these networks get built, and then you have to figure out how to automate these networks, right? Because as the scale goes up, you can't be doing these things manually. So all of those, I think you're going to see players coming in who are good at doing each of these functions and not necessarily all being done by the same guy.